Hello, this is Cheryl Lampard. I'm coming in just a little early as I want to make sure that we're streaming on the right page. I've had a few issues with this streaming software and it doesn't want to stream on the Knitting Matters page. But I can see that I'm streaming and I can hear myself, so that's what I need. Okay, fantastic. Well, hello, welcome indeed to Knitting Matters. This is season 4, episode 3. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really glad that you're here, whether you're watching live or whether you'll be watching the replay later. Welcome indeed. Now, I'm Cheryl Lampard. I'm a fibre artist. I'm a knitting educator. I'm a Craft Yarn Council certified instructor. I used to also be the proud owner of a yarn store in Brighton. And one of the things that I love doing then and love doing just as much now is teaching people how to knit. We're now in the 4th season of Knitting Matters, so there's over 90 episodes on our YouTube channel of the same name, Knitting Matters, and that is actually the easiest way to watch if you want to watch any previous episodes. I'm going to refer in this episode to some previous episodes where I do a particular technique, but this episode will be uploaded later to our Facebook page, the Knitting Matters Facebook page, and the YouTube channel. So in most episodes I'm either demonstrating a technique or using some kind of tool or notion, and although I do mention what I'm using at the time, I thought it would be well worthwhile looking at the tools and notions that every knitter needs, and I'll also show you some of my favourites. I'm not going to talk about yarn in this episode, that's a whole subject in itself, so we'll save that for another day. Let me just switch to the worktop. So the first thing on the list is needles. There's really no one best needle. So much is about personal preference, the way you knit, the way you hold the needles, and that's why there are so many different choices out there. But there's a few things to consider. You need to consider the material, what it's made out of, the type of needle, the length of it, and the thickness, i.e. the size that you want to use. I'm just going to move this camera up a little so that you can hopefully see a little better. So I've got a selection of needles here. These are actually bone needles that were given to me a few years ago. I'm a bit frightened to use them in case they snap actually, but they are rather beautiful. And they're pretty old, I think. I'm trying to alter that light too. There's a bit too much light here. Okay. These are bamboo. I'm going to come up a bit higher. Okay, these are bamboo. That's better. I can see the light is changing. These are little kiddie plastic needles. And I will say that the plastics today are very different to the plastics from when I learnt to knit. I didn't really like knitting on plastic needles when I was younger, but when I discovered bamboo, that was a revelation to me. And typically these are all straight needles, as you can see, and they're probably what most of us learn to knit with. They come in various lengths, from 9 inches, which is this size, to 16 inches, and everywhere sort of in between. So there's quite a variety there of different needles. Now I do like these 9-inch ones for smaller projects and for teaching and demonstrating. These are a good size needles. They're nice to use if you're doing children's garments or small projects, anything like that, and I like them for teaching, because especially if I'm doing a video, because they don't whack on the table as I'm working with them. But for larger projects, and let me get those bone needles out of the way, I'm frightened I'm going to break them. I prefer, but for larger projects, I'll go on to, these longer needles. And years ago, back in the day, longer needles were much more favoured, because you could actually tuck one under your arm and knit with it that way. And that's actually a trend that's sort of coming back again. I know a lot of people that like to do that with a longer needle. They tuck the right hand needle under their arm, and then it's just a case of sort of flicking the yarn over. So that's another reason if you like a longer needle. The only thing I find with the bamboo needles, much as I love them, is when they get really long and really thin, they get a bit whippy. That's the only word I can use to describe it. And that they kind of bend a little. You'll see that as I roll those round, those have bent over the years to not the shape of my hands, but the weight of the stitches on them. They've kind of curved a bit, but they do get a little bit whippy the thinner they get. But it's interesting that although I like to work with a shorter needle sometimes, but for a bigger garment I'd go to a larger needle. When I'm using these steel needles, I actually find the weight distribution is a bit weird for me. I'd prefer to actually knit on the smaller steel needles rather than long ones. There's something about the weight distribution, and they're very slick, they're very nice to use, but it's not the first time that one has gone flying across the room as I've switched needles, which can be a little frustrating and a bit dangerous if you're in the way. So, straight needles. Let's look now at DPNs. These are not necessarily my favourite needles, as I've said before, that we use them for knitting in the round. And again, there's all sorts of types of DPNs. I've got a range of a sort of sophisticated plasticky one here. This is by Prim. I really like this one actually to use. It's got a little kind of rounded end so your stitches don't slip off. They're a sort of almost a little triangle shape in the middle, but they're very nice to hold. I like them. The only thing I didn't like using these for was when I was knitting socks, because they were a bit long, but I like the actual needle and I like that little tip. Your stitches still slide very nicely, but that prevents them slipping off the end. Then of course there's bamboo DPNs here. These are some lovely slick metal DPNs by Cheryl, one of my favourite needle manufacturers. Again, depending on what I'm using, these can be really slick, so stitches can come flying off if you're not careful. Sometimes they take a bit of practice with. Again, different type of DPN, a longer one, more wood texture there. Some steel ones, again, in its own little tube because they're very fine. Those are very nice. They've got lovely pointy ends, but wow, the stitches can fly off those too. These are some new ones for me, some carbon ones from Prim. I haven't yet used them. I'm looking forward to trying those, but I've heard very good reports about these, so I look forward to trying those very soon. And before we talk about the next type of needle, which is a circular, I want to just mention these. I did show these in the last episode when I was using them for making socks. These are flexible needles. There's 3 in a set. These ones are actually by Addy. These are Flexi Flips by Addy. This is another brand, Haya. Same idea. It's basically a very short circular needle. There's no way obviously that you could use those circularly, but what you do, they're sold in sets of 3. You use the 2 to knit with, and then with your stitches on, and then the 3rd to knit with. So I like them better than DPNs because there's not so many changes of needles. So if you're doing a smaller thing like socks, you're not interrupting the pattern all the time. Anyway, they're kind of my new favourite needles at the moment. If you want to see how I used those and how I demonstrated those, look out for season 3, episode 2, where I demonstrated those. I have to do a bit of reshuffling here to get things out of the way to make room for what I'm going to show you next. So, circulars. I do love circulars a lot. I went into great detail on circulars in season 2, episode 15, but there's essentially 2 types of circulars. There's the fixed cable and interchangeables. Circulars are measured from tip to tip. So when it says a 24-inch, it's from this tip to this tip, or whatever the length is. It's not the length of the cable, it's the cable plus the needle. So the fixed needles are just that. They are a needle at either end of a cable. Now, the one thing I do like about fixed circular needles is that there's no issues with the needle tip, the needle itself unscrewing itself from the cable, which does sometimes happen, unfortunately, with interchangeables. There are some tips to avoid that, which I go over in season 2, episode 15. But there's nothing more frustrating than having a load of stitches on your needle and find that as you've moved about and they've come untwisted and suddenly you've got a bunch of stitches that have come away from the needle. Then you've got to kind of rescue them and reattach the needle. So the thing that I don't like about fixed cables is that if you use circulars a lot, and I find them very useful needles because you can also use them for flat knitting, i.e. you're knitting and then turning at the end of each row. You don't have to just use them for joining in the round and circular knitting. You use them, you can just knit flat with them. And I find them much more comfortable when I've got a lot of stitches on the needle than having a lot of stitches on 2 long straight needles, because the weight of the work is sort of resting in your lap, not on your hands. So if you have joint issues with your hands, these may be more comfortable to use than long straight needles. So that being so, one of the reasons that interchangeables became so popular was because you don't end up having to buy, if you're doing a lot of work with circulars, you don't have to end up buying the same size needle, the actual same size needle, in different lengths of cable, because you need different lengths of different projects, and that can get expensive. I know I've got a bunch of fixed circulars here that are all the same size of needle, but the cable length is different, so that can get pricey. So interchangeables are a really nice way to go, and let me show you what those are briefly. So this is an interchangeable set. Again, it's Cheryl, which I love their needles. I'm using that one at the moment, but as you can see, here are the needle tips, and then you attach them in here in this little pouch here. There are various cables of different lengths that you can attach to that needle tip. I'm not going to demonstrate how they're attached now, because you can go back and look at that in the videos that I've done previously. But interchangeables, I really like them. You do have to make sure they're securely fastened. These actually stay really well fastened, I must say, but I have used others that they don't. So whatever brand you buy, think about what the things to look for are cables that don't kink. You really don't want to spend lots of time steaming them out. I think these are nylon coated, these Chalgo needles, as circulars are the metal, nylon coated sort of steel, I believe. There's others here which they seem to spring back into shape nicely without retaining too much memory. You also want to make sure that the join is really smooth. That's really important. I've used needles where you get a little rough patch at the join and it'll snag your yarn. Very frustrating to use. I personally so I do check the joining method if you're using interchangeable. Again, that's especially important for that to be smooth. Needle sizes, circulars range from teeny tiny like this, if you're doing sort of glove fingers or tiny little projects or toys, things like that, to super long. This is not the longest one that I have, but it's pretty long. This particular brand, the one thing I don't like about this particular needle with this sort of transparent cable in the middle is that it's very hard to see the size of the needle. You have to get it in the right light, and it's not always that easy. I prefer them when the size is printed or stamped on the needle. These are stamped on the needle itself. Again, you have to get them in the right light to see it, but this one here you can see very clearly the size. So if you struggle a bit with small print or seeing the right size of needle, you might want to look for ones that are actually printed on the needle part itself. So just some tips to look at, regardless of the brand that you buy. The next thing that I want to show you is stitch markers. The next thing you want in your little knitting arsenal are stitch markers. There are basically two types. There are the ring markers like this, and the little sort of locking ones or light bulb ones. A couple of versions there. There's all sorts of versions of each. This one here has got a little bead on it, or coloured ones. You know, I like the coloured ones because you can sort of, you know, mark them along your knitting, and sometimes I'll use all green ones or all one colour around the work, and then I'll use a different colour for where I actually start the round. But stitch markers are very useful. But the locking ones you can certainly use them on the needle to slide along. I tend not to. I like to mark a certain point in the knitting with these because you can actually lock them into a stitch. These are the type, the ring markers are the type that you have sitting on your needle, and you move them as you knit along. So you can delineate certain blocks of stitches or patterning, whatever you wish, and you move them as you go along. The only thing I would say is just be careful not to, when you finish a row, don't have a stitch marker at the end of the row or at the end of the round, unless you're using something to hold your needles together, because you'll lose them. They'll slip off and you'll find them down the back of a chair or down the side of the sofa weeks and weeks later. So stitch markers, very useful to have in your arsenal. The next thing I want to show you is a needle gauge and a swatch ruler. You have seen me, oh, that's reflecting a bit in the light. Let's swap those over, see if that is better. Yes, I think it is. You've seen me use them in other episodes, but these are very useful tools to have. You can have one or the other. You don't need both necessarily. I just like to have more than one in different places. And why they come in useful is, it seems obvious, but we sometimes forget the sizes of a needle can wear off. If I look again at those bone needles, I can't actually see the size. There is a number there, but it's kind of worn off or not been very well printed off. So now I have a needle where I don't know what the size is. So with these, of course, you can you know, poke these in until, not quite that one. Okay, there we go. Now we know that that's what size that in. Again, you do the same thing with this one. Yeah, it's that size, just fits in. So it's going to be a knitting needle size that's a 3.5 or 3.5 millimeter size. It actually is, which is interesting because, yeah, no, I can't tell from that. I really can't. So. And here, this one is useful too because you've got crochet hook sizes too on this one that you can do the same thing with. So these are very handy to have. The other use for these is that you have the ability to use them as a swatch ruler. So when you're measuring row gauge, when you're measuring stitches and rows, you can use these as a quick guide. It doesn't suffice for the full measuring your gauge, but it's useful as you're going along to check. So those are useful things to have. Oh, the other thing I should mention, if you're trying to work out what needle size you've got, maybe you've been given, sometimes the sizes can wear off, or you may have been given a bunch of old needles or found them somewhere, and that's often what beginners do. They buy a bunch of needles from a thrift store, which is a great thing to do, but the markings may be either rubbed off or you don't know what the size is. And one thing I should say is that metric sizing, I always prefer to look for metric sizing because it's always more accurate. And most needles today do have both metric and either US sizing or imperial on them. If it only has, like these I can show you here, they have both these little kitty needles. This gives you a millimeter size and the US size. Now, if you find a needle which just has a number, say a number 4, that's probably going to indicate, chances are that that's going to be an older needle. Now that's not a problem in itself, but say you have a size 8 needle and you don't know if it's a US needle or an old UK size needle, because back in the UK before we went metric, which is many years ago now, we had needle sizing that was numbered, completely different from the US system. So if you find a needle with just a number, the odds are that it's an older needle, but you need to identify whether it's a UK needle, a European needle, a UK needle, or a US size, and your little needle gauge will help you do that. Okay. So the next thing I think that every knitter needs at some point is a stitch counter. Now, of course, you can simply use a pen and paper, but if I'm in the flow of my knitting, I don't always want to stop and write on a piece of paper, and sometimes I put the pen down and I can't find it again, and then I have to go searching for another pen and all the rest of it. But a stitch counter is a useful thing to have. Years ago, and some of you will remember these, and some of you probably still use them, there were these type of stitch counters, and you simply pop them on the end of your needle and rotate either side when you've finished a row. I don't really like using these now because I just find they get in the way. I'm not mad about them, but I will use them if that's all I've got. Or you could simply not put it on the needle and just have it to the side. It works perfectly well. There's some fancy ones here that you can clip on your finger and just tap when you've done a row. Or you can, I don't want that on my finger, I would have it just to the side of me, but some people are fine with that. This is my one that I tend to use. It's not the quietest because it makes I think it's a rather satisfying click, but if you're in a quiet space or knitting with people that are watching intently a program or listening to something, that could be irritating, but I really like this one. I have this one that's really quite complex looking. It's not. It's pretty useful because you can, if you're doing a piece of work where you need to keep a note of, say, decreases or increases or a change of pattern between rows, this is one that you can set it in 3 different places. You just have to select which colour you want for whatever you want it to tell you. So that could be my increases, that could be my decreases, and this could be a change of pattern or whatever it is. So you would set those and then sort of move that round at every time you make a change. So that's a bit more complex, but if you're doing multiple things, it's a good one to have. Now, as you progress in your knitting, you'll probably end up with lots of needles. So how do we store them? Well, over the years I've used boxes, I've used jars, I've used vases, I've used cases intended for artist brushes. They work quite well. I've used all sorts of things. But in all of those things, you have to go rooting through for the needles, or a matching pair, should I say. So I find for straight needles, this type of roll-up case, sorry about that noise of Velcro, this type of roll-up case is really handy. I like this. You can get a lot of different needles in. This one's got sort of 2 rows and little see-through compartments at either end. But I really like this because I can flap that over, roll it up, secure it with that Velcro band, and my needles are going to be pretty secure. I do like that, having that little flap over, because it means they won't come flying out that end. This one I think I got online. It's by yazzie.com, but you can buy very similar things online and in crafting stores. Anywhere that sells crafting products, needles and knitting, to do with knitting, they'll probably have these. I also have an old one with bigger needles in. It is like a denim roll-up case, and I use bigger needles in there. For my DPNs, I actually just keep them in their packets and keep them in a drawer. You can buy cases for DPNs, and I think it really boils down to how often you use them. Because DPNs aren't my preferred needle, I have fewer of them than circulars or any other type of needle. So keeping them in their packets and keeping them, all together in a drawer works for me. Circulars, though, are actually a different story. The interchangeables, obviously, I keep in their case, and that works just fine. As for the fixed circulars, I've tried various methods. I bought this case, which is all numbered, and you roll up your needles, as it were, and then just slide them into the relevant pocket. What I didn't like about this case was, or cases like this, not this one particularly, but cases like this, it means you've got to pull out all the needles to see if you've got the right length. So if I've got several that are the same size but different lengths, they're all going to go in the same pocket as per their size delineation, the needle size delineation, but now I've got to pull them all out before I can find the one that's the length that I want. And also, if you have got a circular that tends to retain the coil, the memory, keeping them rolled up like that, it's not going to help. So after looking at lots of different things, and I will just switch back here to full screen because I want to show you what is on Mabel here. Okay, so Mabel, the mannequin here, she is wearing a rather fetching roll of needles. Thank you, Mabel, for that. Okay, let me just get them on the table, then you can see clearly how I use it. So this, when I first thought of these, I thought, well, how strange, you've got your needles hanging out the sides, but I really love it. You can roll it up, you can use it and roll it up like that, although you still have your needles sticking out the ends, but if you have a place to hang it, which I do, I find that preferable. So all the needles go in their various size. There's sort of stitched channels here where the needles go in depending on their needle size, and then I just hang it up, and what I find is that depending on the size I want, I just grab it, I look for my size of needle and I just grab it and pull it out, and I can see pretty quickly which is the longest, or if they're marked on the needle like I like them to be, then I can see automatically what size I'm grabbing. Sorry, I know what size I'm grabbing. No, that's not fair. I know what size I'm grabbing because they're marked in the channel, so I put them in the right channel. But I can see just by which hangs down longer than the others, or which is shorter, the length that I want. And then, I just pull it out and work with that. But what I do find is that this one is a bit springy actually. This is a bit this one here is still a bit coily, but it's less so than it was when I first had it. So let me just put that back on. Mabel, I find that really handy. But if you don't have a place to hang it, that might not be useful for you. Again, it's all about what works for you. Right, back to the worktop, because the next thing I want to show you is blocking mats and what you need with a blocking mat. Now, a subject of much discussion is blocking in knitting forums. Some things don't require blocking, but many knitted items do benefit from it. I did 2 entire episodes in season 2, episodes 27 and 28, explaining blocking, showing how it works on different fabrics, and demonstrating why the benefits of blocking. So it can make such a difference to your knitting of your finished work, and it's essential for lace knitting, where you need to set the final shape and open up the sort of the airy nature of lace knitting or lacy knitting. But to facilitate blocking, you need a firm surface like a table, and something on top to pin out the knitting. Now, in the past, before I had my blocking boards, or my blocking mats I should say, I used towels, but the problem is you can pad the surface with towels, but you're never going to be able to pin securely and stretch your knitting out. You're not going to, the pins won't hold in a wad of towels. So ideally you want block-it mats, and these are really foam back jigsaw pieces. I love them because they just slot together. I can only show you a couple here because my worktop's not big enough, but they slot together so you can sort of make the shape that you want. So if you're doing a triangular shawl, you can slot them together in a way that makes sense for the shawl. And then you would use non-rusting T-pins. Again, episodes 27, season 2, episode 27 and 28, if you want to see how it's all done and actually see demonstration of bombing. You want anti-rust pins, and these T-pins are good because you can see them and you can, you know, position them where you want them. There's also these knit blockers by these are by Knitter's Pride. These are super helpful for pinning out straight edges. Okay, if you've got a long run of straight edges, or you know, a shape where you need to, you know, get really square corners, something like that, those are really good because you've got more pins in a row. These single T-pins are really nice if you need to sort of pin out like a fan shape on a shawl. You can really get those edges in, whereas these are really good for straight runs. And there's, you can see they're pretty vicious. They come in a box with a foam inset at the bottom because you really don't want to be stabbing yourself with these, for sure. But I was blocking out a really long thing the other day, and these were super helpful. If you are blocking out things like shawls or very long straight pieces like a stole, you also can get blocking wires. You run these along the edge of the straight edge, and then you can kind of hold them with a couple of pins at salient points, but you'll get a really straight edge in a way that you won't when you're just pinning every you know, few inches or so. So blocking wires, these are quite long. I've got a whole set of these. These are the shortest of my set, but I believe you can buy much shorter ones for smaller items, but they're pretty useful. So that's blocking mats and blocking wires. Now finally, because yes, we've overrun a little bit, finally a few other things that I really like. End points or end stops. Now these things, when you put your knitting down, these things stop the work from running off your knitting. So you can use these, this sort of thing, you know, stops children, you know, hurting themselves on the points, these type of things. Handy, very handy. This one comes in different colors, so you can, you know, actually choose a color for the wrong side of your color for the right side, then you know which, if there's any doubt, you know where you finished doing your work. The problem I have found with these, sometimes they do drop off. I've recently discovered these little things by Addy, and I love them. These are really secure. They come in 2 sizes, really big ones, and they're little spring loaded. So what you would do, put your needles in there when you finished your work. They're not going to, actually, to be fair, they're not going to cover the ends, but they are going to stop your knitting coming off the ends. They're very secure. So if you like to travel with your knitting and you pop it in a bag and you're moving about, these are fantastic. These are good if you want to cover the points, and of course you could actually use both if you wished. These are good if you have children about, or pets that could injure themselves on your needles potentially, but so you could use them both together. But I like these for holding your needles together. Okay, what else do I want to talk to you about before we go? Oh yes, other things that are sort of essential for your kit, or as you develop your knitting journey, you'll want to have cable needles. There's all sorts of cable needles. These have got little ridges in that, you know, help hold the cables and stop the stitches flying off. I like this type with the little bend in them, your stitches, your cable stitches hold there, and are much more secure than just a straight cable needle, I find. And I especially like this type for certain types of cable, because you can leave that either at the back of your knitting or at the front, and your stitches will be very secure and they don't get in the way. Sometimes if you've got a long cable needle, you know, as you're knitting, you can dislodge it or knock it. So those are really nice types of needles to look out for cable needles. Another thing to have perhaps is a project bag. Honestly, it doesn't need to be anything fancy. I have one down here that I'm just actually putting all the all the stuff in that I'm taking off the worktop as I take it. It's got pockets, it's got, you know, I can keep my projects in there, and I can zip it up when I've done. But it doesn't need to be anything swanky. All you're trying to do is protect your knitting when you put it down. And again, if you have pets and they think that your yarn is a nice toy for them to play with, it'll prevent them getting at it. So it keeps your yarn clean, it keeps it in one place. You know, a little canvas tote bag will be just as adequate. So let me come back to you. That was a very sort of quick overview of some of the things I think that are useful for knitters to have. Now, newbies, if you're a beginner knitter, one thing I didn't mention as well, sorry, a crochet hook is always handy. I do think that's a useful thing. Doesn't have to be a fancy crochet hook. It can just be a little tool like this one with a little hook at the end. This is super useful. If you drop a stitch, you can grab it and stop it running any further, and you can also use it to work it back and put it on the needle. So this is just a little tool, very inexpensive, but it's got that hook on the end, and then of course this is a crochet hook. So a crochet hook in your armory is a good thing too, and a sharp pair of small scissors. You are going to at some point have to snip your yarn, and snip it sometimes very close to the work when you're finishing off weaving in your ends. These little scissors will do that nicely for you. Okay, let me go back. Sorry about that, but I did think it important to tell you those couple of things. So if you're a beginner knitter, or you're coming back to the craft and you're thinking, oh my goodness, that's an awful lot of kit, remember, I've spent years knitting. It's what I do, along with sewing. It's what I do. So I've built up a collection over the years, and you know, replace certain things. And if you like knitting and it's something you like to do, you'll gradually build things up. But all you need to start with is simply some needles and yarn. That's all you need to start with to get going. And then once you can always perhaps borrow needles from somebody else if you want to try a circular needle or something like that. And then, you know, you can put those things on your wish list for birthdays, Christmas, or somebody wants to gift you something. But it's always good to try, and there's ways to do that. And you don't have to buy the most expensive thing. Although I'm a great believer in quality over quantity, you do need to try things first. And I would recommend just buying inexpensive needles to start off with. But inexpensive bamboo needles are nice to work with, and then progress from there. So it's just yarn and needles is all you need to get going. Okay, well, thank you very much for watching. I hope you found that useful. If you have any questions, just put them in the thread below. This will be uploaded to our Knitting Matters page tomorrow, as well as our YouTube channel. Feel free to email me or message me with any knitty matters, either questions on this episode or any other episode. As I said before, our YouTube channel is the easiest way to watch previous replays, and tomorrow I will make a list of all the other episodes that I've mentioned and what they were about, so that you can refer to those. If you like it, do subscribe to us on YouTube and let us know on YouTube that you like the episodes. If you're searching for this episode later, it's season 4, episode 3. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, keep well, keep calm, and keep knitting. Bye for now.